Well, the interesting thing about Spark City model is that I think it shows it can be one of those data-driven tools to help you adjust the system. What we used it for is to test our different strategies. We checked if we could see different results depending on what rollout strategy we used. Spark City model was therefore very effective as a what-if scenario. What if we do this one, and this one? What will result in the best strategy for this particular type of neighborhood?
So when I walked out this morning, my girlfriend came up to me. She's like, why on earth are you carrying around a can of hot dogs and a bag of hot dog buns with you? Now, in itself, that's a very legitimate question. However, I said, these are not just hot dogs and buns. You are looking at the biggest mystery in modern-day cuisine. And I need that because I'm going to talk about electric cars and charging stations. My name is Gijs van der Poel, and I, as Martin just introduced, I work in the field of transitions, more importantly, energy transition and mobility transition. And my background is as an urban planner, more specific mobility and an environmental planner. And when I finished my degree, I moved to the University of Lund in Sweden, and I studied what we called industrial revolutions, a time when things drastically changed between one state and another state. And currently we talk about transitions, which practically means the same. We are changing from one field of energy to a different field of energy, one field of mobility to a different one. And with that experience, I help all sorts of organizations, previously for the consultancy firm of Overmorgen, and right now for Alliander, to how to behave in that continual changing context, which for many is very complicated, but it is very doable. And as I said, the last few years, I worked with electric cars and charging stations. And when you work in that field, many people talk about the question, the chicken and the egg problem, how are we going to solve it? Very often that's the used metaphor. We have the question, what comes first? Are we going to build a charging infrastructure before we have electric cars? Well, that's going to be hard to find investors for. Or are we going to wait for electric cars to build charging stations? Well, but no one's going to buy an electric car if they cannot charge. So who's going to break the chicken and egg cycle? But according to Jeff Allen, director of Forth, we've transitioned into a new metaphor. Because which is called the hot dog and bun metaphor. Because if I go to a store, any store, I went this morning to the Albert Heijn around the corner, and I bought a can of hot dogs and a bag of buns, but they are virtually never sold in the same amount. You either get 12 and 10, 10 and 8, 8 and 6, or in this case 6 hot dogs and 4 buns. Which means I either have a bunch of hot dogs with no buns, which gets really, really messy very quickly, or I have a bunch of buns without hot dogs. No one's going to eat that. And the same goes with charging stations and electric cars. And if the food industry cannot match hot dogs and buns, how on earth am I supposed to match charging stations and electric cars? Now, to build a charging network, you need to keep in mind 3 things. And I put myself in quotation marks to make it look more official. Building a charging network is about what, where, and when. And in the case of the Netherlands, as stated before, the vast majority of us doesn't have a driveway, so we rely on public streets. And that means that there is a governmental part that needs to work with this. Now, the what question today is very easy. Public charging stations. So I won't go too deep into this, but it works for fast chargers, semi-public, whatever you want to call it, depends on the context and the neighborhood. Now, a little bit of theory. Where am I going to build my next charging station? And I'm going to start in the top left corner. The early stages, what people do is they want to build in closest proximity as possible, preferably in front of the door of the electric driver. Very stimulating. You have practically your private parking space in the public space, but simultaneously you're privatizing public space, which is not a very cool thing to do. And municipalities don't like that, and your neighbors don't like that. So what we see very often is that municipalities and charge point operators move to the top right corner. They still look where the electric drivers live, where they work, what they visit, but they try to find the spots on the corners of the streets so walking distance is minimized. Very popular, Very efficient because you have a bunch of users for one charging station, but the availability is an issue because it's very scattered around. Now what happens then is eventually cities move downwards. They are not going to look at much at the electric drivers, but they're going to look at their current charging networks. So the bottom right is what they move into. It's a little bit of a circle, even though it's very square. The advanced networks look into robustness. What are my white spots? The city of Arnhem just mentioned, I want to make sure that every neighborhood is covered. Very good for your robustness of your network, but they're low yield stations. So that means that they're not going to generate much activity. So you need to keep that in mind. That's politically a very hard statement. Local politicians will nag about any charging station that's not being used. I can tell this from 800 charging stations of experience. Every single one is picked out. And eventually you move to the bottom left corner, where you try to build charging stations as close as possible to each other. You get charging plazas at very popular places. Good for availability. People are willing to walk a bit further if they know they can charge their car for certain, especially if you don't have to charge every single day. Applicability is an issue. Not every urban structure is suited for this. You cannot build charging plazas at every single street. Now there's a when and why. The when is the one we modeled for the Spark City. There are three systems. You have proactive, where you break the chicken and egg problem by building a charging network. You need to know where you expect your electric drivers to charge. It's a bit uncertain, so it's very risky. Cities don't like risk. Charge point operators don't like risk, so they try to avoid this. But it's very good for irregular users because you cannot do a demand-driven charging network for irregular users. The reactive one, there's a certainty of use. Demand-driven, it was previously called. You wait until someone buys an electric car and then you build a charging station. As I said, you know at least there's one user, and it's very good for regular users because they will go to the municipality and tell them, I've bought an electric car, I'd like to charge here. But there are a lot of downsides to it. Firstly, you need to trust that municipality, they're going to build it, and that trust is very low. The reactive system is the biggest single problem in our charging network right now. Cities, charge point operators, no one is willing to take the risk. You're always one step behind. It takes half a year to build a charging network, and there's a lot less trust in municipalities than a lot of people think. You leave the first step to the driver. The driver has to break the chicken and egg. And then finally, but the governance method, you look at how your current network is being used, and you adapt to that. The upside is it's very effective and very efficient, but I'll get back to that. It's hard to calibrate. Every neighborhood is different. Every stage of development is different, means you need a different approach. And it requires an expert. There's also one other downside to it, which I didn't mention, is you actually need a current network to monitor. So we analyzed what happened in a bunch of neighborhoods when we apply these three different methods. And we looked at number of charging stations. So on the left, you see how many charging stations do we need. Or on the y-axis and the x-axis, you see the number of years. And one of the things that you notice is it differs quite a lot. In the beginning, there's not much change, but if you move into the advanced networks, you see that the reactive, the demand-driven system requires a lot more charging stations than even the proactive or the governance system. But that's not always the case. It depends on the neighborhood. And how are they used? Well, what we see here is that the governance system and the reactive system either have a lot or very little usage, the number of charging sessions. How well is my network working? Am I making any money of people buying electricity of me, which as an owner of a charging network is the most important question. And finally, the average distance to a public charger, which, well, if you have more charging stations, isn't generally lower, especially if you scatter them throughout. But the difference is affordable. If you look at the x-axis, it's all below 200 meters, which is a very accepted measure of walking distance for people. especially if you don't have to use it every single day. So this brings me to the result that one of the things that I've noticed, and we just scratched the surface, so there's a lot more to come, is that a governance method will be as effective and as efficient in advanced networks, even though it will leave, even though the number of charging stations needed is limited. So that means that if you want an efficient network, monitor how it's being used and act on that instead of waiting until someone emails you. And one of the other things we did is we looked at the Zeehelder criteria. They came by, and what I said is, well, I'm going to predetermine the number of suitable locations in this neighborhood for a charging station. Looking at the urban structure, someone asked a question about that. How many can we actually fit in here before the entire place is covered in charging stations? The grid rolls out, the grid runs out, or there are no more wheelchairs that can pass through on the sidewalk. And what you see is that in 2022 in this neighborhood, it's done. In the governance and the proactive, we use that. In the reactive, we said you can build on as much as you want. And in 2022, there are no more suitable spots. So for a city, that means that you need to find a new solution. The way we currently build our charging network with reserved places, corners of streets, not in front of houses, the general, is not going to be sufficient for the rest. So this kind of models helps us to understand what scenarios, how they work, what the different strategies do, and when we get into so-called trouble. But that kind of data is not the essential thing. The strategies are not essential. It's not a goal, it's a meaning. The mean to creating a better city, and data really helps you to focus, to find your weak spots, to help found your strategies and what to do. But simultaneously, these kind of visualizations helps me to understand what I'm doing and to convince my stakeholders and you as an audience that there are some choices that need to be made, and we could use data to help us with that. All of that is just a mean, because the goal always is and should be to create a clean, sustainable, fun, enjoyable city for everyone. Thank you very much.